Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name's Jenna Diaz-Gonzalez. I use pronouns she, her, and I'm the program manager with the Denver Metro Chamber Leadership Foundation. This Virtual Voices series is co-created with our partner TIDE, which is Talent, Inclusion, Engagement, and Diversity, and it's curated for those throughout our networks and the broader community here in Denver and beyond. If this is your first time joining us, thank you so much, welcome. And to all of our returning attendees, thank you for continuing to engage in these very important conversations. And before we dive into our conversation, I'd like to acknowledge the land that we stand on. And as a non-native person, I am very grateful to be a guest on this land. And as part of my personal commitment and a reminder to us all, I want to ensure that we recognize the Ute, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho tribes from whom this land was taken and who were displaced from this place. In this spirit, I'd also recognize the contemporary tribal nations that are still present today and express my gratitude for their continued contributions to our communities. I offer up this acknowledgement, reminding myself and others to honor the Indigenous past, present, and future, and deepen our relationships with Indigenous community. Thank you for joining me in this acknowledgement. And for a little bit of Zoom virtual housekeeping, Nikki, if you could advance the slide. This session is being recorded, as you heard, and will be emailed to each of you after the session, along with also being posted on our Leadership Foundation YouTube channel. Please stay on mute until you have questions for our speakers, and we recommend that you use Speaker View for today's session. We encourage you to engage in conversation via chat. This is always a very engaging opportunity. You can post reflections, resources, and questions throughout the program, and we'll be monitoring that chat. We'll also use that to queue up for questions for our speakers. And if you have any technical questions, please directly chat Nikki Barda on our team, and you'll see her as the host. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, which is Molson Coors, Southwest, and TIAA. Nikki, could I get that slide, please? And thank them for their partnership in this important work. And also a huge thank you for our Virtual Voices Planning Committee. Without the wealth of knowledge and passion of these individuals that you see here, our planning committee, we would not be able to engage in these conversations. They are incredibly supportive and important to this work. Thank you to each of you. All right, next slide. And if this is your first time joining us, and a reminder to us all, we offer up a couple of guiding principles to help set the stage for our conversations. Just a reminder, we always welcome feedback on these principles. They're assume and bring good intentions, really supporting one another and doing the good work, and assuming that people meant well and are doing their best, regardless of how a comment may have landed. Listening with curiosity for new understanding, really pushing ourselves to listen and understand the experience perspective of others, pushing ourselves into new space. Expect and accept a lack of closure, really acknowledging that conversations on race, equity, inclusion often don't wrap up in a pretty bow, and that we should stretch ourselves to be comfortable with that lack of closure. Make space for mistakes, and acknowledge the trauma and resist re-traumatization. Okay, next slide. Before I introduce our incredible moderator for today, since we've launched Virtual Voices, we've held conversations on how racial systems were formed, how these practices were embedded throughout our society and organizations. And what we love about this community that we've formed together is that time and again in the chat and our post evaluation, you've asked us, what can I do? Where do I begin? Really asking for that action. And what better way to learn from our leaders that have already been in the field and have led diversity, equity, and inclusion work at their organizations and can share with us how they put their power into action. So that's what today is really about. And I have the incredible honor to introduce Monica Williams, who's the executive producer at the Equity Project and also president of TIDE and a member of our Virtual Voices Planning Committee. In her role at the Equity Project, Monica partners with organizations in their assessment, strategic planning, and implementation of DEI work to create more equitable outcomes through diversity, inclusion, equality, justice, and engagement. Additionally, she's led diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives for organizations through her experience as the Director of Equity and Inclusion at the Denver International Airport and at CenturyLink through its employee resource groups across 37 states. Monica, I just want to say thank you so much for guiding our conversation today, and I leave it to you to take us away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenna. You always do an amazing job in kicking us off, so I really appreciate you. And I am so excited about today. We are going to have a conversation about power. Now, power being something that I can't be an expert in. I'm not an expert in power, and I'm saying that because I've noticed throughout my work history and just in my living how power shows up in different ways, in both ways of good and in ways of evil. And so today we're going to explore that and how power dynamics can change and can shift and can be leveraged and utilized in ways that will really help us to end racism. And that's really what I want to talk about. What I want us to talk about today is just how power dynamics are playing out in our organizations, in our communities, in our society. And when we take concerted efforts and steps toward shifting power or leveraging our power for change. Now, the idea of put your power where your mouth is, I'll just give you a little bit of background on how that started. We were having a previous Virtual Voices session, and we were talking about, put your money where your mouth is. And I thought, put your power where your mouth is, because as I've been in leadership roles and seeing leadership operate, it was the thing that I thought, are we ever going to be able to end some of the cultural things that are happening, around racism and sexism and, all of its isms? Are we going to be able to change that? And I thought, gosh, I don't think it's possible, because I don't see people willingly giving up power. Will people ever willingly give up power? And so that was the question that I always, would pose and think about, can we change it? And then I started to see more and more, I started to see leaders who actually did delegate their power or share their power in ways that were powerful for women and powerful for people of color. And so it started to change the way I thought about it. And so I thought, if more people did that, I think we will have a shot at changing and dismantling some of the systemic and systematic ways that power and dominance and oppression are plaguing us. And so this panel is going to help us to explore ways that our panelists have done that. And so I would like to just really do an introduction. Well, I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves, but as they introduce themselves, and I'm so happy for this panel, a very esteemed panel, that I want to have our panelists introduce themselves and answer the first question as they do that. And the first question is, what does it mean to you to put your power where your mouth is? And so let's start off with Nora, and then Lauren, and then Shane. If you could introduce yourselves in that way, I would appreciate it.
First of all, Monica, thank you for the warm introduction, and to my esteemed fellow panelists, it's so wonderful and it's an honor to share a virtual stage with you. I want to just thank the foundation for inviting me to be a part of this really important conversation. I am the Executive Director of Museum of Contemporary Art here in Denver. I've been in this role for almost 2 years. And I would say over the last year especially, I've really been thinking and taking actions around how to put our power, our institutional power, and my power as a leader of a larger team into a more equitable kind of how to use my power for good and not for evil, if you will. And I think it's been an invigorating and challenging and humbling process. And I think all of those things are extremely important for us as a cultural organization, as a civic organization that is dedicated to serving the public. How can we both embody the values that we're trying to advance, that we celebrate in the artwork that we present and with the artists with whom we collaborate? How can we embody that internally in how we are structured, how we work with our board, how we kind of scrutinize the structures that have historically kind of contained power in certain ways, and how can we open them up, and how can we reimagine how we can kind of live in the world with a kind of more a different sense of power concentration. How can we cede some of that power, and how can we empower others, both on our teams and amongst our audiences, and certainly with the artists we work with, to help advance, again, the kind of core values that we hold dear.
Thank you so much, Nora. Well said. Lauren.
Yes, thank you. And just want to take a moment to echo Nora's gratitude for the forum, for the panelists, Monica, for your leadership in the conversation as well. And that was a tough act to follow. But first, starting with introducing myself, I have the privilege of shepherding VF Corporation's Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Action Strategy, also known as IDEA, or the function. I've been with the company for 4 years and just coming up on a year in this role. VF is a Fortune 250 company that's comprised of a portfolio of brands like the North Face, Vans, Timberland, et cetera. And our new corporate citizens to Denver have been here for just over 2 years at this point. So really excited to be in this role, guiding some of the strategy that's touching on the conversation that we're having today, and certainly being a part of the broader community. In terms of what it means to put your power where your mouth is, I very much echo many of Nora's sentiments. I mean, for me personally, there's been an incredibly strong examination of the power and the privilege that I personally hold. And I think that's a critical component, is the awareness of where we hold power. And then the other piece to me that's incredibly critical is also doing the examination around values. And I think that matters both on a personal level as well as on a corporate level. And that's very much been our journey at VF, I would say, over the past 5 years, on an intentional journey to clarify our values and to really step fully into our purpose as we've defined it for the organization. And then those two things coming together is putting the power where your mouth is, putting the unique value advantage that you have as an organization or as a person to work in support of your values and in support of the proliferation of your values in the world is really what we're talking about today. And it is not without pitfalls. It is not without setbacks. It is work that exists into perpetuity, as the world continues to evolve, and certainly as the stakes continue to change as well. But it's been an incredible year, I would say, of progress, purely in the recognition and the examination of where our power can be put to greater use. And I own that fully, as an individual, as a mother, as an aspiring healer, as a corporate and global citizen, to certainly espouse that for myself as well.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Shane?
Yes, good morning, everybody. Good to see everyone. Nora and Lauren, you're incredible, co-hosts here today with you, and working through this with Monica and your leadership. I just want to thank you for that. I think a lot of times when you think about power as it relates to this particular dynamic and this particular examination of such an important topic, the role of white males in that particular dynamic has always been one where people are confused why or what or how can we play a role in this. And I just argue that we are positioned to help and to serve and to lead and to leverage the power in which we have been presented in a way that we present a degree of compassion, a degree of humility, and a degree of inclusion that everybody feels as if they can be their authentic self, that you welcome them in a way where there's psychological safety, where you provide a culture in which people want to be a part of it and thrive, and that we as white males have an incredibly important role in doing that. Not doing that is, in my opinion, an irresponsible use of power and can create significant detriment to an overall culture. And so I think it's important that the white male voice is a part of these conversations, because we need to leverage our power in an inclusive, compassionate, and psychologically safe way. And that's something that I want to make sure we continue to do as we have the opportunity to do that. As far as who I am, I'm Shane Portfolio. I'm Senior Vice President of Engineering at Comcast, and I've worked there for 24 years. Prior to that, I was in the United States Army for 14 years and served our country in a variety of different ways, and really proud of that particular experience and what that's done in terms of how it taught me around power and the importance of humility and service leadership. But otherwise, I just am excited to be here today. Nora and Lauren are incredible, and I'm just humbled to be able to share the virtual stage with them today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Shane. You're all incredible. And, you know, when we were thinking about who do we have, we really wanted to have leaders and organizations represented that we know have been leveraging and utilizing power for good and not evil, and understanding that awareness of the power, understanding what power we do have and what power we do own is, I believe, the first step, because we all have power, right? We have power, whether it's expert power or the power to give a reward, the power to punish. There's different ways that power dynamics are operating, and knowing what we do have power to do is the first step. And so I would just like to know from the panelists, and just to talk about, because as we've produced these virtual voices in the series, what we found that our audiences want to know most is, what do I actually do, right? It's what are the ways operationally, or what are the tactics, what are those strategies that you can really bring to life, not just words, but what are the actual tactics or ways that you've leveraged your power to dismantle oppressive systems, to interrogate your systems, to really move and advance the work of equity forward? What are some examples that you would give, or ways that you have leveraged your power in a way to do those things? And whoever wants to take their self off mic first, looks like Shane, you're already.
Okay. So really, I always ground myself in 3 things, because I think if you try to do 15, 18 different things, you end up, you know, pardon my language, but you do a half-assed job at 18 things instead of doing really well at 2 or 3 things. And so I do think it's important that you really focus your attention as what you spend time in this area. And the 3 that I always ground myself in is, am I learning? What am I doing to do that? How am I getting the voices of the different people within my organization to feel as if they are able to influence the direction we're going? Am I listening? I believe that the design of having 2 ears and 1 mouth was not by accident. I think that was with great intention. And I think that it is our responsibilities as leaders to listen to what our teams have to say and genuinely provide them a place where they feel comfortable providing their perspective, and then taking that feedback and doing something about it. is one thing I do, is just, am I learning? The second one is being compassionate, right? I think we are working through, I think, probably the single largest leadership complexity of our entire careers. You think about coming off of a global pandemic, if you think about the elevation of the importance of the DE&I journey that we're dealing with, that we deal with people who've been working from home for 2 years and now we're asking them to come back into an office. There's just so many complex leadership challenges that are going to be presented to all of us, that we have to start with being compassionate, that people are going to be dealing with this in a very unique way, and we need to be thoughtful about that. And as a leader with power, you lack compassion in any of those areas, you have an ability to negatively affect your entire culture. So really be compassionate. And the third one is being intentional. You cannot do this work as a secondary or tertiary priority. I've seen people try that. I've seen people say the right thing. I've seen people send out communication, but then there's no action behind it. So to your point, Monica, this work without action is just something that makes you feel better about yourself, and then it ends up not really making progress. So you have to be incredibly intentional in everything you do. What are the processes? What are the tools? What are the mechanics behind the work that you're doing? How do you go about decision making? How do you go about hiring? How do you go about promotions? How do you go about equity in terms of people's compensation? How do you do all of those things? And if you don't do that with a significant level of rigor and intentionality, you're not going to make the progress that you need to. So I always make sure, am I doing those three things as a leader, and make sure I hold myself accountable to that. And then I obviously hold my leaders accountable to it as well. But those are the three things that I kind of ground myself on.
Thank you so much, Shane. Powerful. Nora, I saw you take yourself off mic.
Yeah, I certainly echo everything Shane said so beautifully. And I would only add to that, I think you have to know yourself before you even know what you need to fix. Like, you need to know what you're dealing with. And I have had the incredible pleasure of being guided through this process by Monica and Dr. Tyler of the Equity Project. And so I've had my hand held through a lot of this. And I think one of the first things that we really recognize is we had to understand who we are in like the current state before we could even imagine where we wanted to head, and whether that's externally, internally, programmatically, what have you. And so I think doing that kind of internal assessment, evaluation, like getting to really, you know, as we say in life, you need to know yourself before anyone else can really get to know you in an honest and authentic way. And so in order to do this work in an honest and authentic way, we had to really scrutinize ourselves, and that revealed so much, and that really informs the directions that you end up taking, because it's really based on what the reality is. And I would say, only to add to what Shane said, is those three values are absolutely vital and critical as one approaches this. I would only add communication, that communicating as a leader, I know what, I kind of know at least what the next steps are as I'm formulating them and as I'm working with others, but not everyone else does. And the more I can share and repeat again, and then share again in multiple ways, in multiple formats, deputize others to communicate those same kind of key messages, I think that's also extremely vital. And that really helps to eliminate confusion, ambiguity, uncertainty, which can really cripple a process like this, because when people don't have accurate information, things can get misconstrued and take you off course, I think, pretty quickly. So communicating often and frequently, why are we doing this? What do we hope to gain from this? Where are we at in our process? And then kind of doing that at a very regular interval, I think, is really essential as well.
Yeah, so well said. I feel like I have very little to add, but what I will offer is, especially from a corporate or organizational perspective, and I think both Shane and Nora have hit on this really well, this is hard work, but it's also, when we're talking about dismantling systems leave evidence behind. It's also an intellectual exercise that requires some rigor to follow the data. And so one of the things that I would add to this is certainly the courage to hear and the courage to have authentic connectivities at the top of my list. But really closely behind that is mining your data for the evidence of inequities, mining your data for the evidence of oppression, and then having the courage to hold that up in front of leadership and establish a plan to address it. And I think there's no kind of coincidence that over the course of the past year, we've seen a lot of commitments come forth from organizations and a new level of transparency that, to a certain degree is anchored in data. And what I would say is there's an ecosystem there. We need to look at the data holistically. It can't just be your talent acquisition numbers, your current representation. This is about in every system and every process you have, applying the filter of equity to say, is there evidence of, the unfortunately white supremacist culture that we live in, the gendered culture that we live in, that is affecting outcomes in our organization. And that work is hard and it's taxing, as mentioned at the start. It's heart work first and foremost, but I think having that intellectual rigor behind the work is also what keeps it sustainable, what keeps it honest, and keeps us continuing pushing forward towards progress.
Whew, that was really good, all of it, right? Talking my language when you talk about the evidence shows up in systems, like there's evidence of it. Like there are signs that these oppressive systems are still in place, and data doesn't tell us the whole story, but it will help to guide us in where are the hot spots, right? Exactly. And so the data element and communication, or talking about this is hard work. And then here I'll say it, if it were easy, everybody would be doing it, right? If it were easy. And I mean, just being able to be with Nora as a partner in her journey and seeing, sometimes it does get hard, but you have to be committed even when it's hard, right? And so that is something that I would, if I could add anything, is that commitment, even when it's hard, even when I have to look at myself in the mirror, and me as an organization or me personally, look at myself in the mirror and say, how do I perpetuate these systems? How do I support them? How do I hold them up? How do I, what's my role? And so, I would definitely echo that. And Shane, your talk about humility and the role of white men, this is not just for a person of color or LGBTQ or for women, those that are historically minoritized. It's not for us to fix. It's for all of us to play a role in fixing, right? And so the power dynamic has the propensity to sit with whiteness, but that's all the more reason for us all to have a role in dismantling and disrupting them. And so, Lauren, I would ask you the next question, which is, in what ways do you see power dynamics needing to be shifted or changed in order to advance equity? And then I'll offer the other panelists the opportunity to answer that too. But what needs to change?
Yeah, that is the question, right? And I think Shane's, very much hit on this, but I think owning a sense of where our power sits and lies, but also really stepping into a culture of allyship and advocacy and thinking about the greater good. And so much of that to me is anchored in community, which has been a really interesting resurgence in a way. I think mostly due to necessity over the past 15 months, as we've all been lacking in the opportunity to connect with one another authentically. But I think that opportunity to think beyond our own individual boundaries, to really assess and define where there's opportunity to raise the bar opportunity for us more holistically, and then taking on true ownership of that really important role of ally and advocate. And Shane, I think, articulated it so beautifully. But to your point, Monica, we all have privilege and power that we can put to work in service of one another. And that, I think, people stepping into that recognition of their own power, how, intentional agency, to harken back to another word used before, but the intentionality of the efforts that we put forth in this space as individuals, but also as broader corporate citizens, is really when the needle moves. And there's been great evidence of seeds being planted in that work, certainly, over decades, but has certainly been catalyzed in the past year, that I'm hoping will continue to sit at the heart of this work, not just what we do individually, but what we do collectively, and the power that exists in that common intention.
Absolutely, it's a collective work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say also, I think being really transparent, like as a public facing institution or organization, there's so much opacity around like how museums operate, what's the role of the board, how does an artist get selected for an exhibition? Now, it's not neuroscience, but it's also like, there is like, a process, but like, why do we have to shroud that process? Why can't we just be honest and open? I mean, there's nothing that I think we've intentionally tried to hide, but the urgency to, make discreet, to share out, to share openly, and to welcome feedback around what those processes are, I think is a really important step in the kind of journey to being a more equitable organization. And I have found it's really invigorating and galvanizing. Like there's so many positive kind of side effects, if you will, from that. People ask amazing questions. There's so much curiosity. Like, why wouldn't we want to encourage that and engage with that and amplify that? And so I think there's like this really great kind of positive kind of feedback mechanism almost that happens, like the more you share, the more you want to share. And also the more you understand, or at least as I've understood, how much has not been shared historically. We had an experience, we've been doing a lot of kind of work to informally create opportunities for our staff and our board to connect. So we've done, it was monthly, now it's kind of quarterly Zoom lunches since we weren't able to meet in person, and different groups, different committees kind of share about the work that they do at the board, and the staff can ask, and it's open to all, full and part-time staff to ask questions and to just learn a little bit more about this organization that they're all really committed to. And we had our nominating committee, which is the committee that invites future and kind of identifies and supports and onboards new board members onto the board. And they talked about their process, and it was really informative. It was really open. It was really terrific. And I shared that experience with colleagues of mine at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and they like fell out of their chair. Like, your nominating committee sat in front of your team and like talked about what they did. And I said, yeah, we all had a really great time. I mean, they were floored. That's just not industry standard, if you will, in the museum world. And I was like, our board was so excited and ready to share, and our team was so interested and curious to learn. It was like a great melding of interest and opportunity. And I think the more we can continue to identify ways, I mean, that's a real kind of specific internal thing, but how we can do that more broadly, I think is really exciting, and frankly is the way forward in order to be a relevant organization in the 21st century.
Thank you so much. Shane?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, power is not pie. Okay, so if we elevate people from a, people of color or women, it's not that we lose any power in the process of doing that. Like, I don't understand this or conversation. It's really and conversation, right? And I think we just got to keep reminding people that this isn't pie. I'm not losing a piece of pie if I have somebody else get elevated to a higher level of power. In fact, if you're in, and I'll just be very transparent with all of you, as a business leader, my objective is to build a winning team. And if winning team told me that I need to be homogeneous and I need to have one kind of way of thinking about things, and then that's what I would do. I'm just be very, very blunt about it. But the data suggests the very opposite of that. The data suggests the more inclusive, the more diverse, the more you bring people from different perspectives, different backgrounds, different socioeconomic experiences, and you have them feel psychologically safe to influence the decisions you make, you build a winning team. And that's what I want to do. Like, literally want to make sure that we continue to increase shareholder value. I would like to retire with my family someday. I'll be very selfish about there are reasons why you want to do this work and why you want to elevate the power of other people. And while it's great from a community perspective and all of those things, and I love that too, at the end of the day, it's value that you create when you do that. And you increase shareholder value, you increase your employees' ability to, first of all, be interested in joining your organization, but then retaining them. Because the data suggests that we actually do pretty good at recruiting. We do pretty bad at retaining. That's where we have to really focus our attention. We can get a lot of people of color, a lot of women into technology. What we cannot do is retain them, because they end up feeling as if they're being disrespected, that their voices isn't being heard, and they will go to another industry where they feel like they can do that. In fact, the data will tell you 64% of women who graduate with a technology degree are out of the technology industry within 6 years, because they do not feel as if they're being respected when they get there. That's the tragic consequences we cannot continue to have. So I just remind people, because a lot of my white male colleagues will be like, well, if we do that, then I'm gonna, no, it's an and conversation. It's all of us in this together, and you will benefit just as much as anybody. And if you really wanna win, look at all these data points of what a diverse, inclusive culture brings to you, and you will win, I promise you, every single time. And then it's just like this really crazy kind of, you see their mentality shift and you see them try it, and then you start seeing that it's actually taking hold, and the next thing you know, you're building winning teams, and you see shareholder value, but you also see a community of people that feel like they're included and they want to be a part of your organization. And then the last thing I'd say is the really benefit of this is that they will start being the words of mouth that you need. They'll start saying, hey, you know what, this company or this organization or this leader feels this way. And we will have people literally making lateral moves, no compensation, no title change, no nothing, just to move into the organization, because they feel like that respect and psychological safety is so important to them that they're willing to be a part of an organization just because of that. And then you can really start working with them to lift them to even higher levels. And so those are some of the mechanics that I think need to be important as we take this journey.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shane. What you all said is just so important to thinking about this, and the fact that it's not pie. Like, I talk about that a lot. Like, there's a fear factor that's there that people don't always want to admit. If you get more, do I get less? You know, this whole idea of scarcity, and it just is not. It doesn't coincide with the data. It doesn't coincide with diverse teams win. Diverse teams are more profitable. I mean, that's the business case of it, right? Like, but more than that, like there is a business case, data supports it. And it's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. And so I think people miss that. And it's so important for us to keep having that conversation. And so as we talk about equity and looking at our systems and our policies and how we're distributing power and how power plays such an important role, I want to ask the panelists, and I'll start with you, Nora, as a heads up. Why do you think racial, ethnic equity or gender equity are so important to be named and to be addressed explicitly?
Thanks for the heads up. You have to know what you're dealing with. You have to know what the challenge is before you can attempt to find a solution. And forgive me, I'm a very linear thinker. So I think about things very much as like problem, solution, you know, destination, journey. Like, so that may not resonate as well with everyone, but, and I don't mean to be overly simplistic, but you have to know, one has to know what one's really dealing with and the messiness of it and the complexity of it in order to rectify it, in order to like kind of wrap one's head around it, if that's even possible, and then develop a really nuanced and sophisticated and long-term approach to addressing it and hopefully removing it, and certainly mitigating it as a bare minimum. But I think on our journey thus far, and I think recognizing that it is a journey and that the destination is sadly probably a bit of a ways off, going up against the systems that are over 400 years old. But I think what we have learned is that it's so like the tentacles really reach out so much farther than we realized. And here we are, you know, an organization dedicated to celebrating the art and ideas of our time. Like that's a really ambitious and lofty and kind of aspirational mission. And we think that, you know, we have done a pretty good job of, you know, living our values, celebrating creativity and all of its multiple and beautiful facets and forms, challenging audiences, not just giving you nice things to look at, but really giving you difficult, meaty things to wrestle with. But that was so, that's so visible, and there's so much that's invisible that we hadn't addressed. And so in order to be able to get buy-in from more audiences, to get support, to get engagement from more people, to again, achieve a sense of relevancy both in this city and then in our field of contemporary art, you know, you gotta look deeper than the surface. And when you look below the surface, it's a lot messier and it's a lot bigger. And it is, again, its tentacles reach much further than maybe one was aware of or one wished. And so I think calling out inequities, calling out systems that are not working to benefit and to elevate and to champion everyone. And I'm speaking more internally in terms of the work that we've done within our organization, but to not do that, we're just slowing ourselves down, right? And so to acknowledge and to recognize that we have things in place that some of which is like low-hanging fruit. You can kind of get rid of those systems pretty easily, but others just take longer to you know, really kind of resolve, if you will. If you don't know what it is, you cannot begin that process of change. And so that is a very difficult reckoning and recognition of. It's not something that any organization is proud of. It's, you know, comes with a lot of disappointment and shame and guilt. At least that's how I experienced it. And so it's like all, I don't know, but it's all required, I think. I think it's essential, at least, in order to get the outcomes that we really want.
And so well said. I'll just double down. I love your visual of tentacles. But I think, you know, the reason why it's so critical to name is because really we're talking about identity fundamentally. We're talking about conversations that are so hugely personal, and there's no universal truth that exists within them, right? The conversation is as unique as each one of us. And so I think bringing that into the light, to Nora's point, creating forums for authentic and connected dialogue and really understanding the spectrum of connection to conversations, both from an awareness, I need to go back to Shane's original point, where people are in their intellectual understanding of equity, where people are in their emotional connection to equity, is so critical to bring into the light in order to create a long-term action plan, to Nora's point. that can support everyone no matter where they are in their journey. You know, when we approach this work around inclusion, diversity, and equity, you know, we've led with the I in inclusion very intentionally, because I think without that spirit of bringing people together, no matter where they are, you run the risk of becoming increasingly divisive with this work. So it's really important to still approach it holistically, to provide the right educational and foundational support for people to lean into this work. And I do think there's an obligation not to make it comfortable, but to support them in their discomfort as they work through this work. And so we've brought a lot of well-being and wellness to the table as part of our initiatives as well, recognizing that it's emotionally taxing. But I think having an understanding of where your organization is, or where your cohort is, or where your team is, and the diversity of connection to the conversation is so important in order to build the right facilitation model to continue to bring people back together in the work.
Shane?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier, it's intentionality, right? And if you're going to be intentionality, you have to own it, you have to communicate it, you have to document it, and then you have to just consistently follow up with it. Because I've seen too many disingenuous efforts in this, where people get together and they have their one kickoff meeting and you're like, okay, that's great, but like, what are you doing every day to make sure that this becomes an integrated part of what you do as a fiber of your culture? And that requires intentionality. And in full transparency, you see the employees who have gone through that multiple times, and they are not going to give you the trust the first time you meet with them. They are only going to do that after you've consistently demonstrated that you're genuine and you're authentic in your commitment about this. And that takes time. As I mentioned earlier to you, Dr. Tyler was with me for my first meeting with my new organization yesterday. And you could just see on their face, they're like, this sounds great, but what are you really going to do about it? Because we've been waiting for this, right? And so now with Dr. Tyler's support, we kind of kicked it off. We got good energy, but if we don't do something with that good energy, it's actually more detrimental that we had that meeting than if we didn't. Because now we've said that we're about something. And then if we don't follow through with action, that's actually worse. And so now we have to set up a construct and really start communicating that. So it's just really making sure not to, again, as Nora said, let's not, not trying to simplify this, but at the end of the day, do what you say you're going to do, follow through on it, and make sure that you're genuine and you're authentic about your commitment. And then people will see it. It takes some time because people are fatigued by disingenuous conversations in this space. But if they start seeing this as real, the energy that comes from that is absolutely fantastic. So that's my continued focus is, are you being intentional about it today?
That is powerful, you all. Thank you so much for sharing those insights and thinking about like the intention, but the action, right? Because we've talked about it for so long. We've had forums and all of kinds of things, but when you really have to start doing the work and taking systems apart and really evaluating like who is this system working for and who is it not working for? That systematic approach and really operationalizing the work. What do these words mean and what do they look like in operation? And how am I going to measure it? Because I should be able to measure it. I just love, I'll go back to what you said, Lauren, earlier. I just love that there's going to be evidence, right? And so how am I going to measure and what's my evidence that either it's working or it's not working, or that what we're doing is really doing what we hoped it would do? And so that measurement is so important. And so this would be our last question. And then if we have maybe 5 minutes after that to take questions from the audience, would you all be open to that? Yeah, because I think this part is so important, is how do you assess what progress is being made? Like, what are your assessments that you're utilizing or your measurements, even if you've just started with a benchmark? How do you assess progress in really operationalizing what we're talking about, whether it be equity, racial equity, gender equity? How do you operationalize that? and measure it?
I'll start this one. I think I have a statement that I use a lot, and I know others have used it too, but you really can't manage something you're not measuring. And so measurement is incredibly important. I'm obviously in engineering, so we measure everything, right? So, and it is also a way to show data to people who think of this as like this kind of specific quantifiable work, right? They think of this work as qualitative work, which in a lot of cases it is. But if you really take a step back and you do the right things and you set up the right processes and you break around the systems that you talked about and you put intentional effort around it, this becomes quantifiable work pretty quickly. And so you can start showing the measurements of advancement, of promotions, of initiatives that are being assigned to people. How are they doing? How are we doing in terms of making progress? What's our overall, in our case, my organization is called Reliability Engineering, and our focus is to make sure that the products that we provide to our customers are as reliable as possible. And there's tons of data you can see that that's either happening or not. And you can see from the lens of a culture that is being led by a diverse workforce and what that looks like in terms of our ability to make progress in that area. And it's time and time again showing we become more reliable the more diverse we become, because people are bringing a different view into how we do it. Because I have a lot of 20+ year tenure. My average tenure actually over 1,000 people is 22 years. So I have a age diversity issue I'm working on too. And as I bring some of the youth in and they start questioning things that have been systems that have been placed for a long time, they start to realize some of our holes that we've had in place, and we start filling them and we become more reliable because of their curiosity and their energy. So there's a lot of those things that we look at in that regard. And those are some of the fundamentals that we focus on every day.
I would just build on Shane's thoughts. I think having clarity around what you're looking to accomplish first and foremost is really critical. So a lot of times I think there are sweeping generalizations around what progress looks like, but on a very granular level, on quarter 1, 2, 3, year 1, 2, 3, what does success look like? Part of that is pacing the work. But to Shane's point, whether it's looking at acquisition, advancement, attrition, certainly there's an element around culture that's really critical that we're measuring on a biannual basis so that we can start to see impacts of programming on a cultural level, with really clear questions specifically around, inclusion, culture of belonging, and fairness, which really all kind of lead back to this conversation around equity. So ensuring our associates are moving in the right direction in their perception of what equity means to VF. But then I think also there's a qualitative component to all of this as well, that's really important. And just as, from a corporation, words matter, certainly from an associate perspective, words matter also. And so we continue to accompany any of our quantitative work with focus groups and interviews and conversations with people, to keep pulse on, again, is the intention that we set out manifesting in the right way? Where are the polarities? And really using voice of associate to guide the narrative of progress versus this top-down, just very data-centric view of how numbers are moving. Because I think how people feel as the work is happening is really important. It's probably the most important part of the narrative. So echo everything that Shane said. And I think the intentionality around defining success is incredibly important. And then the rigor at a top-down and bottom-up level. Every quarter, in the same way that you would report on business metrics, need to be reporting on your initiatives in the DEI space as well.
I'll just add a touch to what these two brilliant people have already shared, which is having a clear strategic plan as to what you're doing and have a very clear roadmap. Understanding that things may shift and change and that you have some flexibility to be responsive should that happen. Should a priority need to be elevated or maybe it's not as relevant or something as one goes through that plan, but having that overarching plan with the timelines and the metrics and all, and that kind of, I think, that's in part how I've felt that we can most successfully really kind of like map it onto our daily work, like operationalize it, as you said. And so that it doesn't feel, I mean, Shane said this early on, like it can't feel like an add-on. It can't feel like a separate thing. It has to be part of all the decisions that we are making on a daily basis, which is a huge and daunting thing to think about in the abstract. And so there have to be these really clear tools that can be utilized to make sure that it is becoming a part of our work and on a daily basis. So I think having that full strategic plan and then seeing the small steps for how you can kind of bring it down to earth, so to speak, in a really tangible way. And then lastly, I would say, yeah, we are all like, we have used the word dashboard like in so many different ways, and how we report with the board, and then how we're thinking about reporting publicly, whether it's an annual report that's, you know, similar to what we do in terms of our financial reporting, that sees, you know, here's what baseline is, and here's progress toward goals. Something like that is just an example of how we're kind of thinking about measuring ourselves and also sharing it publicly to, you know, again, deepen the trust or even establish trust with our public stakeholders, so that there is a sense that we're not just making a statement and then just leaving it hang out there forever, but we are taking actions, and we're proud of the actions that we're taking, and it will take time for that to kind of bear the fruit that we hope it will.
Well, thank you all so much. We did reach our time, but all of what you said around, you know, the intentionality and being methodical about it, having a strategic vision, knowing how you're going to measure it, knowing what you're hoping to achieve to begin with, and having a way to measure that success. All of those things are so, so important and critical. And then getting back to the power dynamic and acknowledging our power, acknowledging how we can leverage our power for good and not evil, and to put our power where our mouth is, to put our power where our intentions are, to put our power where our hopes and our visions and our dreams are. Power is a tool. Power is a lever. Power is a mechanism. And we cannot forget about the power that we all possess to make this a better place for all of us. We have power to do that. Instead of us being byproducts of a system of oppression, what can we do to change that for us and for others? And so thank you all so much, the panelists, not mine, but our panelists, for all of your contributions in this and for saying yes. Thank you for saying yes and making the time for this. And thank you for everyone else who participated and joined. I think we have a quick poll because we want to measure. We want to measure the success of our virtual voices and our opportunities to strengthen them. Thank you again. It was a pleasure being here with you all, and I appreciate you. Jenna?
Yes, thank you. So well said. As Nikki launches the poll, just so we can get an insight on what you heard today and what you'll be taking away, I'll also share with you, if you did not have the opportunity to ask a question to our panelists today, in our post-evaluation email, please share with us what we didn't touch upon that you'd still like to dive further into. And we'll utilize this as information as we continue our Virtual Voices series and set up speakers that will share more information with you all. And part of that post email, in addition to the survey, we'll also send any resources mentioned and the recording to this session. As you see, we have an upcoming TIDE meeting, which is on Thursday, next Thursday, June 24th from 9 to 11. And that meeting will host breakout groups with panel discussions from DE&I experts, ERG, executive sponsors, and ERG members. So please feel free to join, and we'll send the link to register for that with our post email. Next slide, please. Our Virtual Voices series will take a summer break briefly next month, and we will resume Thursday, August 19th. Please keep an eye out for details and for registration on those. I want to say thank you again so much to our moderator, Monica, and to our panelists, Nora, Lauren, and Shane. We really appreciate you joining us and sharing all that wonderful insight. And I appreciate the combination of sort of the business case and the heart case. It's so important to keep that in mind as we move forward and support one another in this journey. Thank you all for joining us today, and we will see you in August.